Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you this Thursday, wherever you are in the world, or if it's Thursday where you are in the world. Really excited, of course, to welcome back to the show Abdaljawad Omar. It has been 4 months, I believe, 4 months since we've had him on the show. And so that is the longest time that we have been without his analysis, thinking, since October 7th of 2023. And so, really just honored and grateful to host him again, to have him back on the show. We're going to talk about, latest developments. Of course, people want to talk about the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. They want to talk about or hear about, what's going on in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Yemen. And so we'll touch on a lot of these different points. And we'll also talk about the Board of Peace. And some of this will be weaved through a series of writings that Abdaljawad has done on Mondo Weiss before, since we last spoke with him. And so I linked those in the show description. Feel free I encourage people to check them out, read them. They're excellent pieces as always. But without further ado, let's bring our guest to the stage. So Abdaljawad Omar is a Palestinian writer and assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University.
Hey, Jared.
Abdaljawad, it's good to be with you again.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for
thank you for joining us. No, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with the war, in Iran. It's kind of the biggest topic right now, is the U.S. and Israel started this, attack on Iran. And, we're now, how many days into it? Like, I've kind of lost count again. I think it's like 18 or something like that at this point.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite, but, it's over 2 weeks at this point.
We're approaching 3 weeks.
Yeah. So I thought we would start kind of talking about, how you're analyzing things, what you're seeing, and particularly kind of the open fronts of the war with the first question. Iran, Lebanon has obviously a front has reopened there. And kind of also the way that the Gulf states and the U.S. military architecture across the region have been brought into the war, as well as how Iran is using the Strait of Hormuz, and just kind of how you're assessing things right now. And starting, I mentioned to you that we both were kind of talking about this interview that Bikram Gill did with Hilia Dotagi, which people should definitely check out. But I appreciated in their conversation that they started not from the perspective of U.S.-Israeli intentions, but like, how do we see Iran and kind of the broader axis of resistance approaching this moment, and their strategy. And then, of course, we can talk more about U.S. imperialism and so on.
I mean, we can say that there has been, to just start off, because your question, of course, touches upon everything, and it's always hard to answer everything in one single take. But I'll start with this. There is a significant radical change in terms of how, and I wouldn't say radical in the sense that it's completely off the previous strategy that has been adopted by the axis of resistance. But I think, this specific campaign that Israel and the U.S. launched came at a specific point, at least in the reading across the axis of resistance, specifically Hezbollah and the Iranian, government, that it's time for a move towards, a much more decisive, much more radical response on their part, taking this war as a war that is existential rather than something, as the outset of, for instance, October 7th and October 8th, when Hezbollah opened the Lebanese front, something of, a backing for the Palestinian resistance, an attempt to deter Israel, attempt to contain its response, that at some level failed. After, I wouldn't say completely failed, but failed on some level after a year or so into the war for a lot of reasons. One of them, of course, significantly is like this intelligence operations that Israel was able to put in effect in the context of its war with Hezbollah specifically, and the Lebanese resistance more broadly. So this is at least one significant shift, and we see that Iranian defenses Hezbollah as well, that reeled from a lot of assassination of its leaders, whether it's military or political, coming to the fore in a way that it has already prepared itself for decades. This is the idea, at least, and part of at least the vision that October 7th initiated was for these forces to, in fact, use their strategies, specifically their offensive and defensive strategies, in a way to challenge an asymmetric power, specifically here the United States and Israel, attempting to erode Israeli and American defenses, but at the same time enable the resistance force to exact a heavy price from any engagement with these forces. And this is, I think, a significant shift that we're seeing throughout this war. And this is why we're seeing from the outset of this war, let's say, something of an Iranian assertion where now it really controls the Persian Gulf. It controls what comes in and out through the Strait of Hormuz. It's using its leverage and, of course, its offensive weaponry in a way that multiply its effects, specifically across the GCC region, where its leverage is actually mostly felt. And at the same time, really exacting a price from the American empire on multiple fronts, whether it's this kind of end of American use of sanctions. This is one of the significant, also, if you want, effects of this war, is that now Iran has its own way of sanctioning the US and sanctioning the global economy and exacting a price. And it's using it through this choke point that is called the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, through the threat of further escalation that could also harm the very existing infrastructure of oil and gas extraction across the Persian Gulf. And I think the second significant, so we have an economic level of the warfare, but at the same time, you have also a military level of the warfare where much of the American infrastructure in terms of the military is being hit in the Gulf area. It's forcing the Americans into this kind of position of retreat and over dependence on air power, and at the same time of hiding their assets and of course their soldiers, most importantly, because they don't want to exacerbate the cost in terms of soldiers coming home injured or dead. And that is also creating a lot of pressure, specifically on GCC governments for different layers and reasons. And at the same time, of course, Iran is also engaging Israel directly, while adding to that Hezbollah, who has for the past 15 months maintained this kind of, quiet, non-assertive political stance within Lebanon, preparing itself for this war and taking the American and Israeli cue in launching the war as its attempt to reassert itself internally, whether it's in Lebanese politics, but also externally vis-a-vis Israel, trying to garner at least some sort of at minimum, some sort of real ceasefire agreement that would actually see the reconstruction of the South and the withdrawal of Israeli troops and the release of Lebanese prisoners that now exist in Israeli prisons. So this is at least what's going on. I mean, we can talk about different dynamics here, but I think what is the radical shift is that the gloves have been to a large extent taken off, but I don't see it as necessarily a complete radical shift because it's still, Iran is still maintaining and Hezbollah is still maintaining some sort of escalatory options that can go, specifically, for instance, in the war in the Persian Gulf. Thus far, except for yesterday, there hasn't been significant hits against oil and gas infrastructure until the Israelis initiated this attack on the Pars gas field in Iran, which propelled also Iran to attack some of the oil and gas infrastructure within the Gulf region itself. Of course, this is also raising prices of oil and gas across the globe, inducing even further and entrenching further deepening the crisis that the economic system is facing globally, and creating at least long-term effects that will be hard to actually recover from, even if the war stops at this particular point and doesn't even go further. So this is what I see, at least going on in terms of the Axis resistance. There's no time for very little movement towards this kind of pragmatic, rationalist, cautious aversion of war strategy, and propelling themselves completely into the war, taking the risks, and of course also maintaining levers of leverage that will be significant as the war moves on.
Yeah, so one of the things that folks have been talking about is the how this has the potential to change some of the, let's call it, security architecture in the region, right? Like, particularly with the Gulf states. But like, historically, the United States has kind of established its military dominance in the region, right? And bases across, the region. And this is kind of what has, been used in terms of defense agreements and things like this, right? And obviously, this is seen by many within the region as an imposition, right? As a form of U.S. imperialism, which I would agree with. And Iran has been able to really kind of expose, right, that this type of security cooperation doesn't actually benefit the people of the region. It doesn't actually benefit even necessarily the states that make these forms of agreements. That they are actually still exposed to military strikes, and that for the most part, this architecture is set up to defend, Israel, right, and to defend American interests. But even in that score, it's really struggling to kind of maintain that sort of defense, right? They're trying to get THAAD missiles from South Korea, right? They're running low on interceptors, these kinds of things. Um, so, what's your feeling around this, assessment around this? Do you see a potential to shift, defensive strategies, relationships? Are things really up in the air to you in terms of how that will play out, and where different countries in the region will kind of move their alliances, maybe not in a like really immediate term, right, but in the mid to longer term?
Okay, I mean, this is a very complex question because I think on the one hand there's this assumption that is going on that the Gulf states are not necessarily invested in this war. And I think this is perhaps a mistaken assumption. It doesn't mean that they're not worried. It doesn't mean that there's no anxiety. It doesn't mean that the war is not harming their brand. For example, the United Arab Emirates with its, pretensions of complete safety and a tax haven and a place for, luxury brands and a calm life and quiet. Of course, this has all kind of imploded and exploded in unexpected ways, specifically for people living in Dubai, for instance. But so there's all these levers of how the Gulf is very fragile in this war, and it's true to some degree that the Gulf would see that this Israeli drive to actually bring the U.S. into this open confrontation with Iran and its success, at least at this specific historical conjuncture, unlike previous presidents who resisted such a move towards complete open confrontation with Iran. They would see it with some sort of despondence, specifically some of the Gulf countries like Qatar, etc. But I do think that on some level, I mean, since the war has already opened up, I think the respective posture of many of the GCC countries' leaders would be, at least let the war be successful. In the sense that they want the erosion of Iranian capacity to actually use its levers of power, whether it's offensive weaponry that we have seen being operationalized in this war, whether it's the drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, etc., or its ability to, for instance, to actually control what moves in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, specifically at this historical conjuncture that is Iran has decided to use this lever and, in fact, choke this Hormuz choke point in a way that actually benefits it. And of course, in a strategic way, because it hasn't really laid out mines. It's using it in a very specific way. It's allowing some ships to go, some ships not to go. It's interplaying also on the international system, signaling, for instance, that it will allow ships that have some sort of, that are dealing with Chinese renminbi, things along those lines. So there is this kind of not only closing of the Strait of Hormuz in this kind of like chaotic or if you want to say all out sense, but in a way that is controlled and managed. So I think the Gulf countries would be also on some level pushing, perhaps on some level, that they don't want an Iran that is emboldened with this type of lever to still persist in the wake of this war. The question, of course, remains whether actually the Americans and Israelis can deliver anything since they opened this war. So this is where it's going to maybe, this is a wager, it's a bet, but I think some of the GCC country leaders will look at it. There might be divisions within the ruling classes there on how best to approach this. Some would want the war to end very fast. Part of the Iranian strategy, at least as we've heard from some of the people close to the regime, has, you know, had this kind of also wager that the pressure on the GCC will force them to also pressure the American government and Israel governments to halt the war, trying to basically close the temporal horizon in the war to some degree. But I do think that the GCC countries will be looking towards the war as a way to force some sort of outcome that's beneficial for them, that would embolden them and embolden their alliance system without the need to make that these questions actually appear to the surface. So war itself could resolve this problem for them. This is one, one option available. Nothing changes, policy remains the same, American infrastructure remains the same, damaged, rehabilitated. But at the same time, if the war's outcome is, for instance, some sort of erosion of Iranian power in a way that will make Iran very weak and incapable of actually using or employing its capacity, then it's a good outcome for the for the Gulf or GCC countries. The second option is that they will start to think or rethink the relationship with the US, but this is also still placing them as the people who are making the decision. What I mean by that is that they're the ones still making choices, strategic choices around whether they want to sustain the relationship with the US, what type of relationship they want to sustain, what type of infrastructure, military or otherwise, that they want to actually maintain in the Gulf, etc. But this is another option, which is the one that you proposed through the question that you've asked. And this is something that I think they will be thinking of course, as this war closes down, is to what extent the existence of American bases is a burden rather than an asset of protection. Specifically, since this war was on many fronts, it seems at least, we don't know for sure, but it seems that it was launched by Israel and the US without necessarily with the complete consent of everybody else. That everybody else whom their interest is at play at this specific if this specific war erupts. So this could lead to some sort of revision, etc. But the third option is that this war continues in a way that actually doesn't leave the GCC countries an option except for the withdrawal of these forces from the region, meaning that it will not be necessarily a choice made based on a strategic review, but rather an outcome also of the physical kinetic part of the war, where American troops are completely unsustainable in the region. This is also a possibility. It might be a more minor possibility, since there's like an asymmetry of power here, and it also tests the extent of American resolve going out in all-out war, to what extent they're willing to put ground troops, to what extent they're willing to invade the Iranian, landmass, to what extent they're willing. These are questions that remain open. But I think this is also the third option, where it becomes unsustainable for these countries, not out of choice, but out of necessity to sustain this military infrastructure that exists in the region, and for them to find some sort of arrangement, either by some sort of outside power of the region, China, Russia, etc., or some sort of security regional arrangement that actually falls within it, Iran, and in which Iran also plays an important role alongside countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, etc. So these are all different options I think at play, and I don't know to what extent which one the GCC countries will actually move towards. And I think the war, its duration, the way Iran is able to really take in the battering that is happening to the country, by Israel and the U.S. specifically using air power, and to what extent we'll be able to sustain this war of attrition in a meaningful way that would become really costly for any sustained American presence in the region for these GCC countries in the coming or near future as well. So I think these are the three options at play. However, again, I would just try to highlight that I think the GCC countries at this specific point will still wager that the war might bring results that are favorable. A weak Iran, Iran without a capacity to threaten the Persian Gulf is the preferred outcome, without chaos on the one hand, so regime collapse or some sort of country collapse, and at the same time with a weakened Iran that is actually more dependent, sanctioned, battered, something like Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War, or the first Gulf War that unfolded 30 years ago.
You mentioned Iraq there, and that's one of the more interesting situations right now. I think obviously, there's been a massive buildup over the last few decades of U.S. military assets there. As a product of really both wars, right? The Gulf War and then the Iraq War you know, that happened under the pretext of Colin Powell and the yellow cake and all that bullshit, post 9/11. Um, so there's been resistance forces that have developed there. In part, this, came out of also Iran's role supporting resistance against ISIS, but also their own, local, and those are local forces and so on, right? And so I'm interested because during the immediate aftermath, of October 7th and Al-Aqsa flood, there was an involvement of Iraqi resistance forces within the axis of resistance. This went on for a while, but it was one of the fronts that cooled off more quickly, I guess, in certain ways. But it has certainly been a very hot, kind of element of this war so far, and I'm interested in anything that you've been tracking there.
I mean, the Iraqi resistance has been really operating since the outset of this war in a way, on a sustained pressure, specifically on American bases, whether it's in the Iraqi Kurdistan area, specifically. Also, there are some forces aligned with Kurdish movements that are considered opposition, and are Iranian in origin as well. So they've been attacking these bases in Erbil and other places, including a base called Victoria as well, where there's American forces, and at the same time the American embassy in Baghdad itself. So there's been sustained pressure there, and I think also the Iraqi resistance function as a way to also monitor incoming aircrafts going into the Iranian airspace or across the Iranian airspace from the Gulf region. So they played that role. Also, they to provision that, and of course they have also an ease of also participating in any attacks against GCC countries, whether it's Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, or others that are close by from the Iraqi landmass. So they have been operating, they have been energized since the outset of the war, and they have been playing this increasing role. But they're, of course, like everywhere else, specifically outside of Iran, there are oppositional forces to these moves by the Iraqi resistance and in their formations, by other forces within each, polity. Whether it's Lebanon, for example, with Hezbollah taking the decision to actually participate in this war for a lot of its own strategic reasons, including that the fact that Israel, by being busy bombarding Iran, putting a lot of its assets in the air to actually go into Tehran's or Iranian airspace, that they have a better chance within this domain to actually impact and have a multiplying effect, if you want, in hitting Israel continuously and repeatedly every day, without taking much of the pain alone if a war with Iran is not really occurring. This is one of the elements. It also stretches Israel too much. It stretches its resources too much. Israel is also thinking of how many, bombs it has, how it will really lead the economy of assets that it has. So this overstretches Israel to some extent and gives Hezbollah a bit of breathing space. But whether it's in the Iraqi resistance or the Lebanese resistance, they're facing, if you want, internal pressures by governments that are aligned one way or the other with the US, and that are being placed to actually are being really situated as part of this American-Israeli strategy as a way to fracture these societies even further and deepen the rift between different parts of the society, whether it's on sectarian basis or ideological political basis, and create the strategy of containment from within. Meaning that part of, for example, American strategy in Iraq is to use the Iraqi army against these Iraqi resistance formation. Part of the strategy in, for instance, Lebanon is to use the Lebanese state and its army, or push the Lebanese state and its army towards open confrontation with Hezbollah, criminalizing Hezbollah, etc. All of these moves that we've been hearing about, of course, coming across on the news, being leaked by Axios, for instance, or being leaked by some major newspapers around possible direct Lebanese-Israeli talks, and of course, in fact, Israeli open declaration of what the Lebanese state should do to stop the bombardment, which means that they want to transform basically these, if you want, state-sponsored armies into something like the Palestinian Authority security services in the West Bank, that they work on the behest of the Israeli security apparatus. They coordinate with the Israeli security apparatus, the American security apparatus, and at the same time, they become local native agents that actually fight or resistance in multiple fronts. So there is this attempt of regionalizing, if you want, the system that already exists in the West Bank. It is, and part of that attempt is through the strategy of containment, and of course, setting up or pitting internal forces against each other in each of these domains, specifically outside of Iran. Of course, in Iran itself, part of the fantasy strategy is, I'm saying fantasy strategy, is that based on this war, there will be an open rebellion by the people, by some sort of mass population. So there's not really an existing organizational form on which America and Israel can really rely upon, like Iraq and Lebanon, for instance, the Lebanese army, or pushing the Lebanese army towards open confrontation with Hezbollah, or the Iraqi army, or pushing it into an open confrontation with the Iraqi resistance. So in Iran, they have this fantasy of some sort of open rebellion, demonstrations, opposition that would take over the government, or at least, propel Iran into its own internal civil strife for months, and exponentially erode its power even further by this kind of internal civil war that would be occurring. This is part of the fantasy, at least, of the Israeli-American strategic planners that is now being operative. So, and we can see it playing out across the region in different domains. But the effect of also having these forces, at least, whether Iraq and Lebanon, and at the same time in Iran, at the same time in Yemen, is that they also serve as levers of options for direct engagement, for guerrilla tactics that include the use of ballistic missiles, that includes the use of cruise missiles, that include the use of different levers, including drones, etc. But also at the same time, they also are, by their sheer existence, if you want, and outside of Hezbollah, specifically the Iraqi resistance and the Yemeni, they have, they can be operationalized as well to contain any type of movement, whether it is, a ground invasion by the Americans towards the Iranian landmass, or at the same time, a more open participation, which we didn't talk about with the GCC, a more open participation in the war efforts and actually engaging in the war openly. So, so this is part of the levers that also exist, and that will be operationalized by the Iraqi resistance, and specifically the Yemeni resistance at this specific historic moment. And in each domain, there are, if you want, specific goals that you can speak about. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is speaking quite openly about the need for a ceasefire agreement where Israel actually seizes the fire, that it will not be able to cross, that will withdraw from the 8 points that they have occupied within the southern Lebanese, region, and at the same time that they would be able to get some sort of reconstruction going on and bring the people back towards their villages in the south, something that has been denied for the past 15 months or so. So this is the goals of the war for Hezbollah, for instance. It's actually a ceasefire agreement that actually preserves the ceasefire and creates a form of deterrence that would enable, life to go back without Israeli power always, attacking Lebanon, killing people, destroying more houses, creating the conditions for an emptied southern Lebanese villages, etc., etc. In Iraq, it is actually a move towards an attempt to actually, drive American and European forces out of Iraq almost completely. So it's this kind of idea that these remaining forces need to be, out of the country. They should not be part of any kind of security architecture or arrangement within the country itself. So there's this kind of actual goal of not only backing, for instance, or avenging or participating in the war as part of the lever that Iran also is using by backing these forces, and these forces also choosing to participate in the war on their own volition, but also having this kind of specific goal in mind in terms of clearing out American existing forces, and of course, including, for instance, the militarization of American embassies, and the creation of American embassies across the region that are much more militarized, much more complex, if you want, CIA stations with intelligence infrastructure, etc. So the embassies have actually lost their value as this kind of diplomatic, public relations, council services, etc., and have become more militarized generally, and therefore there's also these kind of direct hits towards the American embassy within Baghdad itself. Anyways, I mean, this is the picture, at least the way I read it. Yeah.
No, thank you. We'll go back to some of these other fronts maybe in a little bit, but I do want to shift a little bit and talk a little bit about a few of the other pieces that you've written, and specifically, let's talk about the Board of Peace, right? Because this is something that obviously you've been paying attention to, you've written about, and in particular, you wrote a piece that really is thinking through how the Palestinian resistance is navigating the Board of Peace and the difficult sort of options in navigating that. And in part, how does a resistance force sort of move through a compromised space without compromising its own, uh, you know, understandings of what it is, I guess, in some ways. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about those dynamics in Gaza right now and kind of where you see them. I'm interested if you see any, um, you know, any shifts since you wrote that piece, or if you still see things also as kind of where they were when you wrote it, and maybe talk a little bit about your analysis there.
Well, I mean, it really depends on how. I mean, right now, I think the war opened something significant as well, is the possibility of resolving all issues at once. So I'm not saying that this is something that will happen, because there is a chance, of course, because war is uncertain, because, as they say, depending on what happens in the field, the field of war, the field of this kind of a struggle between wills, the struggle between weapons, the struggle between different subjectivities, the struggle between, things could go another way. But there is a chance to have some sort of more all-encompassing agreement that comes out of this war, that falls within it Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Iran, Yemen, etc. And that, in fact, propels, if you want, some sort of also arrangement that has Iran using its levers, but also using its diplomatic now might, based on the levers that it has, not only to get its own specific goals, but also to protect its own influence across the region, including, of course, in Gaza. So this is a possibility. It's not really being invoked, so I'm just thinking of it here, in the sense that I don't see any signs of it, in the sense specifically outside of this arrangement now going on between Iraq, Iran, and specifically between Iran and Lebanon, because there are talks about binding these two fronts together in a way that would make any arrangement out of this war also binding in both Lebanon and Iran. But other than that, I think that this is also significant. The war is significant in this sense. It's just opening again the horizon for perhaps different arrangement, for the Board of Peace becoming less important, something else replacing it. So things are currently in flux. This is what I wanted to note in the beginning. The second thing I think that is essential, of course, the Board of Peace, as you mentioned, is one of these tools that fold within them the old jargon of technical governance, um, neoliberal market arrangements, radical reforms, between quotes, of, for example, land owning arrangements within the Gaza Strip itself, a Palestinian native administrative system, depoliticized and monitored and picked and by America and Israel. And at the same time, it has this quality of temporal deferral, meaning that instead of actually resolving anything, what it does is actually give some sort of hope for resolution without resolution itself. So it sustains, the image of Gaza has gone through this process of a ceasefire. Now there's a board of peace taking a bit of a lever and control, but it really did not take any lever of control. Israel still controls everything, but it gives this facade, and it gives Israel a bit of leeway to say that its genocide has ended in the Gaza Strip, when it actually continues on multiple fronts. It still controls half of the Gaza Strip. It's still bombing the Gaza Strip. Even as we speak, there's still, assassinations and massacres happening in the Gaza Strip. There's lessening of food coming into the Gaza Strip after the war. So there are still this kind of mechanisms that Israel is actually pressuring and placing even further and further vis-a-vis the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip, in order to pressure it even further to hand in the weapons and to ensure whatever complete surrender means. But of course, we will not stay at this kind of, we hand the weapons and the Gazans can remain. It's, you hand the weapons, and some sort of ethnic cleansing campaign can also take place as a result. So this is the context of thinking the board of peace. It's some sort of performative facade that enables existing policies to continue, while speak of resolution, or speaking of some sort of resolution without actually resolving anything. And it's not new because this is the Oslo arrangement. It's not new because it is a politics of temporal deferral and management. It is also a politics of attempting to, in fact, effect an aversion or a turn away of the world's gaze from Gaza towards other issues. So, and on these levels, there are some successes. Like, I wouldn't say that it was not it was a complete failure. It's a success, at least from an Israeli and American point of view, because the pressure coming, at least from organized movements mobilized around Palestine, has lessened. Significantly. Of course, there were moves by some workers' union in Italy that shut down some of the ports, etc. That these moves have halted. There's less pressure. Of course, there's still a lot of talk about Palestine, the cultural domain. There's still a lot of protest. There's still a lot of people engaged in the global Palestinian movement one way or another. But it has been reduced, because there is this kind of paradox that massacres propel people to look, when massacres kind of between quotes but they continue in different form. The gaze kind of turns away, and people can look towards other issues, other concerns, whether it's on the individual level or collective level, etc. So on this level, it has been successful. The problem, of course, for the Palestinian resistance specifically, that it cannot really operate outside of this lever, because it did want to halt the massacres themselves. It did want to halt the destruction of the Gaza and at least give it a pause. And there was, in many ways, this demand by the Palestinians in Gaza for things to stop, because after 2 years or so of bombardment, massacres on a daily basis, 100 Palestinians killed on average every day, there was this kind of exhaustion of living within this domain of uncertainty. And on some level, this board of peace arrangement slash or ceasefire enabled at least a halt and pause on these fronts, and enabled, of course, the Palestinian resistance to consolidate itself in the Gaza, what remains of the Gaza Strip, under its own control, and of course repair itself as as Hezbollah was doing in the past 15 months, repair itself, try to take levers of control in its own hand, fight against some of the forces that appeared throughout the war, specifically the gangs that are aligned with Israel, continuing the work on a social, economic level, clearing things out, distributing food, reasserting some presence for the health sector in the Gaza Strip, all, of course, on a minimal level, and all are minimal level because Israel still prevents, a lot of the things that the Gaza Strip needs to actually come in any significant way. So it enabled the Palestinian resistance to reach this level. But of course, the Palestinian resistance still does not want or does not seek, an arrangement where it would see itself surrendering its weapon, at least without an actual appearance of some sort of political arrangement that would fold within it this idea of a state of Palestine, which is not something on the American-Israeli agenda at this current moment. So this is the trap that we're in. We were living within this kind of temporal deferral. Something has been taken away. This gaze that the world was actually intensely looking at Gaza, and the Gaza being the center of the world. through these kind of ceasefire maneuver. But on the other hand, what we get is a more entrenched Palestinian resistance, capable of at least partial rehabilitation of itself, and at the same time, the ability to at least pause or stop the massacres in the rhythm and intensity that they were on that level. So this is part of the arrangement. Now we haven't moved, I think, and we were not going to move to this kind of second phase of the board of peace, except unless either the Palestinian resistance in fact moves towards giving up its weapons, or unfortunately that Israel will actually reignite the war in a way uh, um, or maintain the situation as is without any significant or radical changes, but most likely actually reignite the war in a way that would enable it to, bomb more, kill more, destroy more, and in the hope of also reducing the population of the Gaza Strip or driving them out of the Gaza Strip. If they are also preparing arrangements that we've heard about before in terms of what they're planning in the other part of the Gaza Strip, the 50% their control of, driving people to Rafah, maintaining them in this kind of closed city that would be rehabilitated, but also encourage some sort of either voluntary or forced migration from the Gaza Strip as a result. So I think there's still this kind of temporal struggle. There's still an ongoing genocide, if you want, and even the war in Gaza still remains, if you want, in question. Even the war as it, used to, the war in its intense rhythm could return at any moment. Of course, now the Israelis and Americans are busy with Iran and Hezbollah, etc., but it could return also at any moment.
Do you think there's any calculation in which the Palestinian resistance forces in Gaza would would basically walk away from the Board of Peace deal and become more involved in direct confrontation again? I mean, I don't say that lightly because I understand, how brutal and devastating, this war, post October 7th has been on the people in Gaza, right? So I understand that any consideration of that would obviously have to take into account, you know, how the people within the terrain, within within Gaza, within the Gaza Strip, you know, feel kind of on a popular level about re-engaging that. And but I do wonder because of you know how the ceasefire, quote unquote, has been managed, right? And the fact that there still has been destruction, the fact that there really hasn't been the type of relief that would allow for reconstruction, people rebuilding their lives in a kind of really meaningful way, as well as obviously Iran entering this war, returning, responding to this war that was struck against them in a more decisive fashion. Hezbollah obviously taking in its own considerations around, this being existential for them, given the way that, the US and Israel have kind of imposed, policies very antagonistic to them within Lebanon to a certain degree. Um, and yeah, I just wonder if you and I mean, the other thing that's noteworthy is that yesterday, Hezbollah for the first time was able to fire a rocket 200 kilometers into 48, right, and get close, basically, relatively around what's considered the Gaza envelope, like this area just sort of on the outside of the Gaza Strip. And so I'm just curious if you've been thinking about this at all.
I mean, I doubt that the Palestinian resistance is capable of like opening a front in the war in this kind of active, proactive sense. It would make sense if they did want to, that this is the time to do it because it does also fold within it these other fronts and their intensities. But I think after 2 years of war, there is a erosion, first of all, in the capacity of resistance itself, but also in the ability of the people to withstand any more massacres in the way that the Gaza Strip has been treated in the past 2 years. So I think that for now the resistance will avert itself. But of course, this is all based on analysis from the outside. You never know what the resistance forces themselves see or build their own, strategic, if you want, options on. For instance, Hezbollah, when it entered the war, a lot of people were speaking of Hezbollah as in the past tense. Hezbollah was, not Hezbollah is. They spoke about its weakness, about the decapitation of its leaders, of the loss of many of its first and second generation, also military commanders. Um, and they were correct in their assessment in the sense that Hezbollah was weakened. But of course, they overestimated the extent to which it was defeated or weakened. And surprisingly for Israel right now, as it engages in the war with Lebanon, you see, for instance, a Hezbollah that is willing to actually take risks. There has been sustained pressure on the northern, settlements, rockets every day. There has been, a re-energized fighting capacity, but most essentially, at least thus far, what we have seen is also an Israeli failure to really harm the military and command structure, or to infiltrate through its intelligence Hezbollah in the way that it did in the past, at least thus far. I mean, we don't know what the future holds, but there has been also a couple of failed attempts of assassinations that we can also pinpoint towards as part of this kind of Israeli failure at this moment. And of course, the direction of Israeli strategy thus far has been to exact a price from the civilian Lebanese population, and of course, to hit the infrastructure of the Lebanese state as a result. So we don't know. I mean, Jared. So there is of course an argument that would be for a participation by the Palestinian resistance for this war, but again, I doubt it. I don't think that the relationship with the population of the Gaza Strip would sever even further after 2 years of exhaustion. Thousands of people killed, the destruction wholesale of the Gaza Strip. Currently, still 50% of the Gaza Strip or so is still under Israeli control. That the resistance for the Palestinian resistance, if it's not really able to create some sort of a real impact or effect militarily on Israel, that it would engage with the Israelis at this level, or bring forth an opening in this front at this current conjuncture. But yeah, I mean, it does make sense to think about it, but I doubt that will happen.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. Um, let's pivot a little bit and talk about, U.S. Israeli strategy. What how they're approaching this. I mean, you wrote a piece about the recognition of Somaliland by Israel, and kind of like what that spoke to from your analysis in terms of kind of regional, strategy post October 7th, and um, particularly, obviously, taking in consideration of the Yemeni front in, in the first kind of, I guess, phase, the 2-year phase of this war. Um, and I guess, I mean, obviously, the other big question related to that is with Iran. You know, there's a lot of hemming and hawing and inconsistency, right, in terms of what is articulated as strategy, even by the United, whether it's Trump or Hegseth, or, any of these kind of functionaries within US empire. And I mean, obviously, a lot of that, as Rahmani could say, it could be kayfabe, right? It could be just sort of a show, right, in a certain way of, um, you know, and we've had a lot of that in U.S. history, right? Of this kind of idea of it as a bumbling, empire that just accidentally steps on a war, and doesn't really know what it's doing. And a lot of times, those kind of arguments have been used to, actually justify or provide cover for U.S. imperialism, as just thinking through it of like, oops, we make a lot of mistakes, kind of thing. Um, but how are you looking at the arrangement of U.S. and Zionist strategy in this moment? And I think, as you wrote in the Somaliland piece, you're kind of thinking about that in that piece as well. So maybe you could fold that into your response.
Yeah, I understand. I understand how people have a lot of analytical investments in the way they view this kind of relationship between the U.S. and Israel. So sometimes, when you have an analytical investment in one side of the argument, you want to see everything going from or proceeding from that side of the argument instead of other sides, or perhaps a more complex picture that emerges between different things that are really at play at the same time, including that empire sometimes, overextends itself, sometimes makes a choice for a war. It's a choice and a decision for it that proves to be a war too much. I mean, it's not the first time that the Americans, for example, attempt such shaky, if you want, war of choice. Vietnam is one example of a domino theory propelling war in Vietnam. There's more complexity to that, but then at the same time, getting invested, entrenched in Vietnam, losing tens of thousands of soldiers, and eventually leading to its defeat. So, I mean, there are multiple ways of viewing this. I don't think that American and Israeli converge necessarily in what they want out of this war completely. Uh, you know, at least the Americans, on some level, entered this war, and it seems that they are stumbling. At least if we believe the narrative coming out of, Washington, in terms of American underestimation of what the Iranians would respond with, the sense that the Americans did not really take seriously the Iranian threat to close the choke, and the Strait of Hormuz, that they will not attack, the GCC countries, that, they will remain timid, conservative, restrained, things along those lines that perhaps is true or not true. But it seems from the amount of deployed forces in the region and the amount of which or the wager on a shorter war, that at least America did not anticipate until now this kind of longer duration warfare that would see a war of attrition happening between it and Iran across the Persian Gulf. So there is divergence between, I think, Israel and the U.S. because you would see, for instance, that American interest would also be stability, maintenance of low energy prices, not riling up the markets, not inducing even further doubts about a collapse or an economic recession or even depression or stagflation or inflation returning in full force. You would think that these are all things that it would consider as it makes this decision, but despite that, it still took the decision to go into war. So there is a heavy cost with this war. It's not like any other operation that you would engage with and you would anticipate minimum cost. There is a heavy cost involved in it, and it would actually harm American consumers, American, everyday people in the gas stations, food prices, etc. So I think that that would be significant, at least in terms of the thinking of any strategic planning around, Iran. And of course, the other argument would be that there is a concerted strategic, rational decision here being taken, in the sense that Iran hasn't been weaker before. And if there was a argument for a direct, open confrontation on a kinetic level, that it's the time to do that, and the time to do that now, specifically after the 12-day war that deprived Iran of some of its nuclear assets. We don't know the extent of the damage to the nuclear facilities. And at the same time that Iran lost Syria, Iran is reeling from assassinations, also in the 12-day war. Iran has lost some of its assets, also in the 12-day war that Israel launched against or vis-a-vis Iran. Hezbollah is weakened, etc. It's not the deterrent that it used to be, in the past. So that this is the time, that we could actually bomb Iran, degrade its capacity, move into some sort of state collapse or change of in the composition of the very ruling class in Iran with minimum cost. That's the other thinking that is also possible, and I think this is the argument that at least would have been advanced in preparation for this war and as a way to induce its possibility. And this is the Israeli argument specifically, but also argument probably within the American administration for why war with Iran now is one that actually would make sense, at least in terms of strategic planning, putting an end to Iranian capacity to threaten the Persian Gulf, making sure that Iran is weakened, sanctioned, without any levers of power. And of course, that strategy could backfire. But this is the rational, at least, way of thinking of how American strategists might have convinced themselves that this is a war that they can come out with on top, with a weakened Iran having eroded its capacity to regenerate any of its weapon systems, and at the same time having made it into this kind of timid power, or as the fantasy says, or the planning says, that this kind of weakened, hurt, eroded Iran would face internal strife at some point in the future, and perhaps some sort of revolutionary impetus that would actually change the whole system and turn it somehow into also a Western aligned system. So these are all possible. I mean, it's possible that this is the way America convinces itself that this is the time for war. There's operational plans. There's possibilities for assassination. There's good knowledge of Iranian storage facilities, manufacturing facilities, the military industrial base on which it relies to produce much of its weaponry. There's things have been laid out in a way, and Iran is weakened, and therefore we can hit Iran, weaken it even further, erode its capacity further, and get away with it. And I think that's the convincing argument that was made, and therefore we now see ourselves in war. It doesn't mean that also Americans anticipated completely the terms of reaction, or that they're now not fumbling, in the sense that what we're seeing in terms of what they're signaling, even in their attempt to maintain, for example, low oil prices, or in their attempt, one thing that Secretary of Commerce Besant, I think, said today is like that they're going to allow Iran to sell its oil because that will lessen, so Iran will make more money from higher oil prices, while at the same time the Americans want that to happen because that will still contain any form of supply shock to the oil and energy sector in the world more broadly. So these are the things that are occurring. There's a fumbled sense of America being led in one direction or another, not with this kind of deliberate form of planning. There's this unpredictable, uncertain figure at the helm of American politics by the name of Donald Trump, that moves, right or left, or moves in a way that is not really necessarily highly systematic. Of course, some people are making the argument that there is some sort of something systematic going on in American policy, but we've seen him, for example, threatening Greenland but move away from it, then going somewhere else. There is some sort of attention politics at play with Trump, and this kind of ability to change his mind, completely and radically on a whim. But now he entered a war that I don't think, the Americans and Israelis completely control, because they don't really control the end of this war. I think one of the things that also Iran realized, and I think Iran will make the point in this war, no matter what the cost is for Iran, because it is hemorrhaging a lot of, of its assets. It is, the country is being systematically also on multiple levels, being destroyed. Specifically, many of its key assets are being, bombed and, degraded in massive ways. But I think Iran wants to be able to say in this war that it ended the war on its own terms, and it ended it in its own time. And I think that will be significant, because that also would mean that if in the future anybody thinks of attacking Iran, that is something that they will have to take account of, that the war will not end on the American and Israeli schedule. And we should remember that part of the logistical operations that are now being, placed, whether it's the Israeli Air Force, attacking Tehran, or and Iran more broadly, or whether it's the American assets in the region, moving and attacking Iran, the more time passes, the more these assets are eroded. In the sense, the more the time passes, the more they will have to think about an economy of how they use their weapons. The more the time passes, the more they will actually expend much of their interceptors, for instance, in the air defense domain. But also in the airplanes, these airplanes that travel thousands of miles and come back, and they need fixing, and they need, a lot of maintenance, a lot of, change of gear, etc. So there's an entire operation, logistical operation behind that. And the more time passes, the more, Iran has levers, specifically as Iran can actually, if you want, contain a lot of the hits, or at least bear a lot of the hits, and at the same time still sustain an important lever that it has, which is choking the Strait of Hormuz and attacking American assets in the region, and weakening also, if our economy is going down, your economy is going down. If our infrastructure is going down, the entire GCC infrastructure is going down. This is the type of deterrence that Iran is placing, including that you don't get to open a war with Iran and choose when it ends. And I think this is an important element to which Iran will actually be devoted, and will ensure that if there is an end of the war, that it will be end in its own time, and of course within the conditions that I think, at least diplomatically, that would be permissible for it to say that it came out of this war at least having stood its ground and perhaps achieved some sort of its own diplomatic goals vis-a-vis its relationship with the US, and of course in this context Israel as well. So I think that is also part of the equation. Having said all of that, I think the Israelis have a much more chaotic policy, and we can divide it into two. The Israelis, on the one hand, really, and I said this a couple of times here, are not as strategic in their thinking. They're operational in their thinking, they're tactical in their thinking. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day they don't have political outcomes. They do, but in the sense, for them, operations precede strategy or precede the political ends. And sometimes, even if they define goals, these goals they're not very wedded to, in the sense that they're, very fixated on this specific goal in this specific arena. That they're very flexible, flux, because they kind of are in a society. We are facing a society that is in perpetual war, and meaning that it also understands that war bequeaths its own, if you want, results, end game, etc. From the Israeli perspective, they've always, had this wet dream of American Israeli attack on Iran, and now they get it. That's the first element of it. So this is a successful, this is the first Israeli success in terms of drawing the Americas into complete and open confrontation with Iran since at least 30 years, since Israel began lobbying, if you want, the United States of America for this kind of open confrontation with Iran. Second, for Israel, the idea here is that more time passes, the more America is, drawn into this war, the more it will invest more of its assets, and specifically, perhaps even going as far as a ground invasion or some sort of, embroilment in the Iranian field that, would enable Israel to actually, come out successful from this war, and having gotten the Americans to do the dirty work that they cannot do, which is actually go into Iran in terms of a land force or anything along those lines that Israel, for obvious reasons, geographic, but also for social, political, and for this kind of lack of will to sacrifice, would not be able to do, which is like to send its troops towards Tehran, or engage in any kind of, land invasion of Tehran or Iran more broadly. So this is something that the Israelis would want. So they don't mind this kind of open confrontation. Of course, it is costly on their society, it is costly on their economy, but they can bear with it. We see huge supports within Israeli society. I mean, 90% or more of Israeli Jews support the war. So they are, bearing the brunt of the war, even if it has, it's eroding some of their economy, their image as well. Even in the US, it's creating, an acceleration, if you want, even within the right wing, in the US, of this kind of America is, America first versus Israel first, fault lines that have appeared in the American right in the past year or so. But at the same time, Israel is squeezing whatever it can get from this use and employment of American power, and pushing the Americans towards more confrontation, and convincing the Americans that they can get something out of this war that is significant, and get a win that, can be advertised to the world as strategic and decisive. I think the second thing is that Israel, for itself, from its perspective, destroying Iranian industrial capacity, destroying Iranian, manufacturing capacity, destroying Iranian missiles, launchers, drones, soldiers, eroding its internal security services, assassinating its leaders. This is all will serve, if you want, to weaken Iran. And the more they can actually accumulate some of these tactical successes, the more it opens the possibilities further on, even if the war stops today, tomorrow, after tomorrow, or in a month or two, the more it opens up the possibility of its own ability to stand in the region without really any significant rivals, specifically anti-hegemonic rivals like Iran, at play. And I think one of the elements, of course, that it's seeking, and this is the second lever of the policy, and this is where it fails, Israel fails of translating any type of military successes into some sort of diplomatic political language, is that it's demanding from everybody total surrender. It's demanding from everybody decisive end, for instance, of the Palestinian question. It is going into this kind of like hyperbole, total, victory type of mania that it wants to sustain, even vis-a-vis, for instance, forces like Hezbollah. For the past 15 months, they've been basically saying to their own society, Hezbollah is defeated, it's weakened. Not only weakened, defeated, complete. It's not the same Hezbollah as before. And suddenly Hezbollah is back at the borders, sending missiles towards all of these border settlements like Kiryat Shmone and others across the Galilee north of Palestine, and at the same time engaging Israeli forces in the same intensity, even depriving the Israelis, as we said, from that kind of intelligence that served it well in at least the initial phase of this war, in the beginning of, or in the wake of October 7th. So, where is the total victory? And part of Israeli society is now asking itself, where's the total victory vis-a-vis Hezbollah? Where's the total victory vis-a-vis Palestinian resistance in Gaza? Where's the total victory vis-a-vis, even Iran? I mean, of course, it is weakening these forces on some operationally, depriving them of resources, leaders, etc. But at the same time, is really incapable of completely finalizing that narrative of total victory. But what it can actually achieve is this kind of regionalization of what one of my articles are called the terror regime that we Palestinians in the West Bank faced in the past 50 years or so, which is the idea that Israel can go across the region, choose who to kill and not to kill. It can have the freedom of action, for example, in southern Lebanon, to go in and arrest whoever it wants and leave or not arrest whoever it wants. It can place local forces that also are and somehow in coordination or collaboration with its regime of terror. It wants to sustain this kind of securitized buffer zones, whether it's in Syria and Lebanon. Sinai is also another example of a buffer zone. Even Jordan, people make the argument to Jordan itself as a country as a buffer zone. But the whole point that I'm trying to at least articulate in this sense is that Israel wants to regionalize its ability to basically sustain a long durée war against these resistance forces, because it also understands that a total defeat of these forces needs a lot of time, and that it needs for it to use its power for a long durée. But it wants to use its power in this way that is very cost efficient, without friction, and without response. That's what it seeks and yearns to do. And it's something very akin to what's happening in the West Bank, for the past couple of decades, in the sense that in the West Bank, Israel maintains its occupation and army. There's a Palestinian Authority that rules over people's civic, cultural, educational, etc., giving people a sense of autonomy, for, of course, a full sense of autonomy. And at the same time, it can come, arrest, kill, do whatever it wants, annex more land, take up more of the resources, push people into tighter zones where they cannot really build outside of these zones, steal more of the land, entrench settlements, etc. And even if it doesn't have any plans for settlements in southern Syria or in places like southern Lebanon, it might have in the future. The fact is that it wants to regionalize this terror regime and this ability to take these decisions, whether it's in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, in Iran itself, so that it would have total um, uh, total total control of its decision-making project without any friction. And in this sense, the destruction of the ballistic missiles that Iran has, the destruction of the rocket arsenal that Hezbollah has, the destruction of the resistance forces themselves, the weakening of them, or their surrender, or their containment, or erosion in a way that is significant, will enable Israel to do this with minimum cost coming on its, returning to it in any significant. And in fact, in the past 15 months in Lebanon, we saw something like that. No? Of course, Hezbollah was repairing itself and preparing itself for some sort of other battle or other war because it saw that there will be another war. And then it chose this moment to launch that war. But the fact is that in the past 15 months in Lebanon, for instance, Israel chose when and who to kill or what to destroy in Lebanon without any significant repercussions. So this is the thing that Israel kind of imagines, and it's still not ready also to go into the domain of trying to achieve some sort of diplomatic and political resolution, even on terms that we as Palestinians or anybody concerned about Palestine would not like. It's not necessarily wanting that, because also diplomatic political resolutions with a country like Lebanon, etc., will include some sort of self-limitation in Israeli use of power, will include some limitations on the way it maneuvers across the region. Because the problem with diplomatic arrangements at the same time, as much as they provision some sort of security through diplomacy, etc., and in fact they should, and they are in many ways a Zionist twin strategic triumph, whether it's, for example, the neutralization of Egypt in 1978, or the agreement with Jordan in 1995, I think, or six, I forgot. But the point I'm trying to come across is that they still are agreements that limit Israel in some level, limit its ability to move its assets, to create this kind of freedom of action across, the region. It's something that it wants to sustain, at least in the immediate to medium run, and it's something it's working towards. And I think it doesn't want to pay a price in return, of course. And for 15 months, it had that paradigm in Lebanon. Now it ended. We don't know what will happen in Lebanon itself, but I think this is part of its, at least its policy, this kind of regionalization of its terror regime. Just the idea of I can kill whenever, destroy whatever I want, and arrest whoever I want, whenever I want, without repercussions. And in that light, they're also trying to strategically align themselves with some countries like the UAE and building some of the bases because of the threat, for example, of Ansarullah in Yemen. They're trying to also expand their military presence. But again, one of the problems with Israeli kind of mentality, it's paranoid security gaze, if you want. It does not really have a strategic vision from whatever it thinks things through expansion, buffer zones, security. So it's a country that is high, on its own, mersh, if you want, and in this sense that it does not really have a vision for what it wants to do with all of these assets. It's highly addicted to its own formula. I will garner more security for instance, these border settlements in northern of Palestine that sit across the Lebanese, by placing some points within southern Lebanon and destroying the villages. Okay, did that achieve that? No. What does that mean? Entrench yourself deeper, for instance. Swallow more land, for instance. Attack more, kill more. So it's not really offering, if you want, anything of any. It's all about this kind of, if you want, a philosophy of opening up possibilities, not committing to any form of resolution, no strategic revision of really what it wants, except of weakening its enemies and the forces across it. As it does that, it's also weakening its own standing. As it does that, it's also breaking some of the pillars of the US, for example, Israeli alliance, which is, for example, popular support has eroded. For the first time historically, we see a major shift in American attitudes, as reported recently, for instance, that now more Americans support Palestine than support Israel, for instance. We have, a breaking up of even the right wing, conservative coalition that has backed Israel for the longest time. Doesn't mean that these public attitudes will directly impact policy in the near future for a lot of different reasons. But at least it's eroding a lot of its own standing, its own pillars of security as it does. So as it erodes it's also being eroded in many ways. It doesn't mean that because it's coming out, with this assassination of Ali Larijani, or the assassination of Nasrallah, or the walkie-talkies, and but in a nutshell, it's still a country that is highly dependent, as we said multiple times on the American military industrial base, on the Western military industrial base. It's a country that signals that it wants to be a super Sparta, but at the same time does not really have the capacity to become a super Sparta in the sense of being an independent, power without the need for others. It's still dependent on the politics of others. And now it's pushing towards a war that seems to be, at least from the sense of perception, there are things that are fumbling. It doesn't matter if this is all deliberate or not. The perception that is being laid out for people is that there's no real concrete strategy. And perceptions sometimes matter more than what's actually going on in terms of whether it is deliberate or not deliberate. In the sense that this is the perception coming across the globe. Trump entered the war on the behest of Israel. Maybe that's not the case, but that's the perception. The perception of this war is that Americans don't really have a concrete strategy of how to resolve the issue of Strait of Hormuz, at least for now. They don't have an alliance system around them. Europe just rejected, for instance, any participation in opening the Strait of Hormuz or any sort of participation in the war vis-a-vis Iran, at least direct participation. So you have a fumbling also Western alliances. It's not something like what happened in Iraq in 2003, where a lot of Europeans were excited to support the United States of America, because America has already also eroded its relationship with these Europeans, on a lot of fronts, because of its closeness to Russia, because of this talk about around Greenland, because the Europeans are moving towards this kind of, we understand now that we need some sort of strategic autonomy from the US and we cannot depend on them and their protection vis-a-vis Russia. So we need to create our own mechanisms, and they're investing more in the military. So they're breaking off slowly, and America is also accelerating that process for its own reasons. So they don't have really a lot of support across the world as well in conducting and going this war. So there's all that perception of an uncertain, indecisive, incompetent strategy vis-a-vis Iran. Of course, again, Israel is happy about that because we get to take our shot, and we have American power backing us and doing a lot of work that we could not do on our own. But it's still, it's something that I think is impacting, if you want, not only American standing in power, but also eroding again Israel's levers. And I think there is something to the saying that Israel is squeezing whatever it can get from the US, because it does realize on some level that not only is Iran is in a weak position, and therefore it's open for business or open for kinetic engagement on military terms, but that Israel also understands that this is not going to be really repeatable in the future in terms of changing American administration, the layout of the Congress in the future, that public attitudes are being shifted, that even if it fights its own fight within American electoral politics, etc., that it will lose a lot of support that it used to rely on in these domains. And at least a lot of the relationship with Israel will be questioned in much more open ways, as we already are seeing signs of, at least in American politics.
Yeah, thank you. Um, I'm conscious of time because I know that we talked about this being a shorter one before we started. But let me ask you just a question back to the Strait of Hormuz for a second, because there's a lot of discussion about the arrangements in which ships are being allowed to pass through it, right? Whether they're, paying in Chinese yen, whether, this is a threat long term to the dominance of, the US petrodollar, right, which finances the military and so on. Um, and also in a consideration of Iran right now, right, in terms of, being able to actually extract the resources, the money, right, that it would need to, if the US and Israel are not willing to pay reparations for this war, then be able to use passage through the Strait of Hormuz as a lever to essentially finance the the rebuilding, the reconstruction, and basically exact a price, not only on global trade through the strait, but also to the benefit of them, and also as a way to regain what has been historically taken in terms of sanctions of Iran, right? And this seems to me like a very significant lever, right? And obviously, I understand, as the play of the war, right, will determine ultimately at the end of the day what they are able to exact through that. But um, that seems like a fairly significant element of this war right now is whether Iran can in fact maintain or develop that sort of arrangement through how this war proceeds, which would actually not only allow it to kind of maintain its place regionally, but perhaps strengthen it, right? And strengthen also the kind of, if we think about this anti-hegemonically, right? If we think about US imperialism, Zionism, right? But we also think about, something like China and the countries that have closer relationships with China. And, you know, so I'm just interested if you have thoughts on this element of the war and, equation on the whole.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, look, one of the problems, of course, with resistance forces generally, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, whatever the resistance forces, there are also contradictions within these forces, and they're internal to it, imminent to it, in the sense of like, um, for the longest period, for instance, Hamas was operating between this tension between governance, responsibility for the population in the Gaza Strip, the welfare of the Gaza Strip itself, and at the same time being a resistance force that is meant to actually, build the edifice of the ability to challenge Israeli power and, create the conditions for an anti-colonial resistance to persist without a lot of quiet on the Israeli. The same goes for Hezbollah. It's an institution. It has different class arrangements. It has, a political side, a military side, but at the same time, it also has a lot of these contradictions between this kind of desire to preserve itself on some level, and at the same time resistance being always something that places its own edifice of power under conditions of strain. That goes also for Iran itself. On the one hand, it is now in an open confrontation, as I said in the beginning of our discussion, that Hezbollah and Iran and other resistance forces, are coming into this war realizing that it is make it or break it. It is an existential question. Therefore, they are not really being as restrained and as pragmatic, and this kind of timid manner through which perhaps in the past they tried to on the one hand participate and support the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, but at the same time maintain their own power edifice and not exposing themselves too much to the consequences of the war. And of course, Israel had another idea of what they wanted to do, and that was not sustainable for the resistance forces in the region. Now they're coming to this confrontation wounded, but also energetic and rehabilitated on some level, and without as much restraint as before, in a way in which this knack for an actual active open resistance is kind of prevailing on this attempt for self-preservation through avoidance or through an attempt to actually maneuver oneself out of the need for an open confrontation in one way or the other. So I think this is one level, but I think they still coexist in tension in the context of the war in Iran, for instance. On the one hand, Iran has an incentive to end the war today. No, it is being bombarded. There's an erosion of its facilities, its infrastructure, its military industrial complex as well, etc. All of the different levers in which Israel and America is engaging in this kind of wide bombardment of Iranian, assets, on the ground across the Iranian state. So they have an incentive to also halt the war on some level. They have an incentive to reach some sort of conclusion of this kind of kinetic open war that has been open. Now, I think for now, as I told you, I think what triumphs is that America and Israel have to pay a price. We have the leverage in controlling the Persian Gulf and specifically controlling what comes in and out of from the Strait of Hormuz. And at the same time, they have this leverage of also attacking directly the infrastructure on the other side of the Persian Gulf in the GCC countries, including, of course, the military infrastructure. And they will continue using it. And by the way, this is the most important Iranian lever in this war, even more so than the rockets that is throwing at Israel, although they're important and significant, but even more so than that. But there's also this kind of self-preservation element. And what you can always be afraid is that that kind of rational, pragmatic voice triumphs in a way, for instance, that would see an end of the war in Iran, but still its continuation in Lebanon without any resolution for Lebanon on the one hand, which will weaken, of course, the position of Hezbollah with Lebanon. Or you would see some sort of resolution in Iran without, necessarily Iran getting any sort of qualitative different arrangement than the one that preceded the war. In the sense that I think for Iran now, the idea of reparations, the idea of lifting sanctions, the idea of not being shackled in the way that the economy and its politics has been shackled for the past 40 years is also one of its major indirect demands. So there are, I think, these different forces moving. And sometimes I think this knack for self preservation in a way that sustains these institutions also perhaps kill some of their soul, if you want, or kill some of their actual, rationale for existence, and eventually erode their claims of being anti-hegemonic forces if they are trying to be an anti-hegemonic forces, as preservation triumphs over actual open confrontation. And I say that because I am also Palestinian, and I come from the experience of something like the PLO, where these kind of contradictions or this dialectic between self-preservation and revolutionary politics eventually led the PLO to betray its own revolution and to betray its own people and become this kind of comprador class that basically is happy to collaborate with the Israelis and kill the possibility of resistance. In many ways, killing its own, if you want, self-image, historic self-image in the present, and trying to basically extend this defeat. So I say that from that position of knowing very well what could happen to some of these revolutionary forces once this kind of knack for self-preservation becomes the one that they stick to too much. This doesn't mean I'm not calling for this kind of radical, but it just means that these are part of the levers that exist, and I think that is part of the tensions that also exist perhaps within Iran. You can see it in analysts speak today. People talking about, for instance, Ali Rajani being a moderate, conservative but pragmatic. It's somebody you can talk to. So Israelis took him out because he's one of the off ramps that Trump could use to end the war. Things along these lines, of thinking about how different elements within, for example, the Iranian state, who's consolidating power within the Iranian state in the wake of the assassinations, what currents are basically more propelled to the fore, what form of decision-making processes are taking, to what extent Israel has disrupted these decision-making processes, and to what extent is there anybody to speak to in the Iranian side, to what extent, for example, the image that is being constructed from, Western mainstream media around the role of the IRGC, around, things along those lines that are desiring and seeking this type of open confrontation for some time, and now they get a shot at it, and now they're in the driving seat in the Iranian among the Iranian decision making process. So I honestly, like, you cannot really read the histories of resistance without reading these kind of tensions that exist. And there is reasons for these tensions. They are immanent to condition of attempting to resist an asymmetric power. They come from the high cost of engagement and open confrontation with an American, military power or an Israeli military power. They come also from building an edifice of power and wanting to preserve it for whatever reason, whether it's for internal reasons, political reasons, social reasons, economic reasons. But at the same time, I think at least now what we're getting is a version of the axis of resistance is trying its best to actually build again some of its edifice of power through the open confrontation. And it doesn't see really anything beyond, because returning to a state, even if Iran doesn't really get hit again, but still under sanctions, still weakened after it's taking this heavy bombardment, is also returning into a state that Iran remains a bit weakened. Its levers of power, some of some of it, the Americans and Israelis would have successfully actually, taken away from Iran itself, and at the same time, without necessarily being able to garner something in return that not only would secure itself against future war, but at the same time would actually secure a perhaps anti-imperial, anti-hegemonic horizon that is much more. And we can see that. I mean, this is not a critique, but you can already see it. This is just a symptom. You can already see it on some level in the terms of expectations that everybody's placing. You know, Hezbollah, for instance, went from uh, a very open discourse around liberation of Palestine, for instance, towards today, for example, speaking about a ceasefire that is actually a ceasefire as an ultimate end goal of this campaign, military campaign that they're launching for a lot of understandable reasons. It's a message towards Lebanon. A lot of people are complaining about the return to war. There's a lot of internal resistance, specifically outside the direct social base on which resistance relies in Lebanon itself, but also within the social base, there was some sort of complaints, etc. So they wanted to minimize it. They're not speaking these kind of grandiose claims that perhaps persisted for a long time in the past, but minimizing it towards and catering towards a direct social base that is paying the brunt of the price at this moment, of course, with homes being bombed, people are being martyred in their homes, destruction of Dahi Janubiyya, the southern district of Beirut, so that is part of the discourse that is, that is appropriate politically at this current conjuncture, but also tells us something about, the current moment in terms of also what it is, the goal, the end point that resistance forces are seeing. And then don't get me wrong, it would be a success to put back the monster in the barn, if you want to, to rein in Israel down, to create enough deterrence that Israel doesn't dare to create this kind of freedom of movement, regionalization of its terror regime, and of course defeat its project in Lebanon of normalization and peace agreements, and turning the Lebanese state into some sort of Palestinian authority that works on its behest. That is a success. That is a strategic success. It's strategic denial of Israeli aims. So it is significant in of itself. But I'm just speaking about how the discourse itself has, taking, some sort of transformation also throughout, the past 3 years, and that also includes Iran. I mean, Iran did raise now the bar. It is speaking in some, not necessarily in official capacity, but it's speaking about reparation. It is speaking about guarantees of its own security in the future that include, for instance, a withdrawal of American forces from the region. This is something that they have actually placed front and center, but we'll see, because these are things that are world changing. The hold that Iran has on the Strait of Hormuz is also world changing. It is disrupting trade and creating a shock in the energy markets. It will affect people's lives, not only in the region, but across the world. This is something that is significant. It will raise prices everywhere. It has a significant toll, not only in the region, but outside of the region. And now also not only in terms of discourse and ethical moralizing, who's right, who's wrong, Palestinians and Israelis, but also now people will start to feel the effect of what Israel has destabilized in the past 3 years, including its genocide, including its levers in Washington, taking a huge hit economically in the gas station as they see the prices go up and up, and as they see, of course, food prices go and inflation, being driven exponentially upwards. If we don't get also some sort of severe economic crisis at some point in the future as well. So I think that is all happen. So there is a world shaping event, if you want. But again, I was trying to lay out that kind of contradiction between self-preservation that includes some sort of accommodation towards vis-a-vis American imperial powers, Israel as a colonial power, some sort of accommodation and understanding uh, that could also come at the expense of any claim of anti-hegemonic, anti-imperial stances. That is also part and parcel of the history and the contradictions that also these movements historically, face in the face of overwhelming forms of power that they have to challenge and try to defy in many ways.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. All right, I'll give you one more. There's other stuff I wanted to get into, but I'm going to we'll use it as an excuse to invite you back more quickly so that we can talk about West Bank and Birzeit and all of that, because I do want to talk to you about those dynamics. But we haven't really talked, much except in reference to Yemen, and obviously their, posture, to the Bab el Mendem Strait, is significant. They have thus far, it seems, I haven't been following it too closely, but I've tried to stay abreast of some of their statements of basically saying, they haven't entered essentially because they think Iran at this point, doesn't need them to enter. But that if they felt like that was a necessity, that they would, do it. And obviously, with the Strait of Hormuz closed, certainly I mean, I know that is huge in itself, just given that 20% of the world's oil passes through there, a ton of the fertilizer passes through there for the globe, and so on and so forth. Um, but obviously, the Bab el Mandeb Strait is also a very significant, node of, you know, logistics globally, right? Of the flow of capital through it. Have you been following, and what is your assessment kind of, where Ansar Allah and Yemen kind of stand in relation to this right now?
Well, I mean, I think that for multiple reasons. I mean, if you remember, Ansar Allah also entered the war alongside Hezbollah as a force backing the Palestinian resistance and attempting to stop the genocide in the Gaza Strip. First, because they thought this is what is right at that particular historical moment, morally and politically, and at the same time, I think it is also because it was also a very popular, something that would stand with their own social base, something the social base would be willing to sacrifice much of its, also well-being in support of the Palestinian resistance and attempt to contain, or if you want, stop the Gaza genocide, or at least extract the price from Israel. So it was a popular policy. It was also the right policy, and it aligned, if you want, with Ansar Allah geopolitical position and claims. Of course, the war was costly with Israel, and it cost them a lot of the infrastructure that exists within Yemen. So there are, restraints, at least for now, on the part of Ansar Allah, that to what extent they want to risk another open confrontation with the U.S. and Israel at this particular moment. But I think more significant, I think part of the this position within Ansar Allah is, on the one hand, it is positioning itself as one lever of escalation that could be used in a later period in this war, specifically if we see an entry of Arab forces, direct and open, in the war itself, or if we see, some sort of, more threat being placed on the Strait of Hormuz, the ability to open the Strait of Hormuz, in the sense that Iran, for now, is switching one choke and maintaining another one open, but that it's still, signaling that the two could be closed, and therefore, if the two are closed, that will even exacerbate the economic crisis that we are already inducing in slow terms in a much more exponential sense, because then, you're talking about much more significant forms of trade, not only oil, also moving through Bab el Mandeb and through the Suez Canal upwards. So for now, I think this is also one of the elements that is deterring, for instance, also European participation in the current war. It's part of the calculation of that. It's maintaining this kind of, like, we're going to this option of closing the Strait of Hormuz, still maintaining this kind of squeezing effect on the global economy, but still maintaining some sort of restraint, and of course allowing the Iranians and the axis of resistance levers of escalation as the war proceeds, and as the Americans and Israelis choose in which direction they want to take the war further.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Look, Abdul-Jawad, thank you so much. It's been great to be back in conversation with you. I recommend people read all the work that you've been putting out for Mondo Weiss. Is there anything else that you want to share or say before I let you go?
No, I mean, yeah, I think we covered a lot of things. I hope we talked, we talked for quite a while. I talk a lot, so I'll just
No,
close my
very
mouth
much,
now.
very much appreciated. Thank you to Dwayne Monroe and Charles for your support. Um, PJ, dollar hegemony going down. We can all hope. Um, and this is the best analysis I've heard so far. Thank you both. So yeah, we won't make people wait another 3 or 4 months before we get you back on. Can't wait to have another conversation with you, and so we'll be in touch on that. But as always, thank you for joining us and sharing all of your analysis.
Thank you, Jared, for having me. It was great.